We are going to spend the next hour analyzing what is, by almost every metric available, the single highest grossing media franchise in human history. We are talking about a property that has generated revenue figures that are frankly difficult to conceptualize, spanning video games, trading cards, anime, feature films, and an endless ocean of merchandise. We are going to trace the biography of this franchise from its conceptual origins in the mid-20th century all the way through to where we stand today, here in early 2026.
It is a massive subject. The sheer scale of the property often obscures the intricacies of its business history. Most observers assume this is simply a Nintendo asset, but the ownership structure is significantly more complex and unique in the entertainment industry.
Yeah, that is one of the first things I want to unpack because it really sets the stage for how this whole machine operates. You look at the box, you see the Nintendo logo, and you assume they pull all the strings. But the actual machinery behind it is a joint venture. It is not owned by a single entity. It is split between three distinct companies: Nintendo, Game Freak, and Creatures. Which honestly sounds like a legal headache waiting to happen.
It is a complex arrangement, but it provides necessary stability. This tripartite ownership forms what we know as the official company that manages the brand. To break down the division of labor, Game Freak is responsible for developing the core role-playing games. They are the creators of the canon. Creatures manages the trading card game and various spin-offs, while also handling the 3D modeling of the characters. Nintendo publishes the games and manages the console hardware and international distribution.
Right, so it is a system of checks and balances. You have the hardware giant, the creative studio, and the merchandise specialists all locked in a room together. And our mission for this analysis is to really understand how a project that was initially doubted by its own publishers and created by a man who started out writing handwritten newsletters evolved into a multi-generational global phenomenon.
To understand that evolution, we must begin with the creator, Satoshi Tajiri.
Exactly. Tajiri was born in August 1965. And to understand the DNA of this franchise, you have to look at his childhood in Machida, which is a suburb of Tokyo. In the late 1960s and early 1970s, Machida was not the urban sprawl it is today. It was still very rural, filled with rice paddies, forests, and streams. And Tajiri's primary hobby as a child was collecting insects. And I do not mean he just looked at them. He was completely obsessed with catching them.
This is the foundational concept of the entire franchise. He would explore ponds and fields, hunting for beetles and other small creatures. It was an obsession with cataloging and collecting natural life. He was actually known among his peers as Dr. Bug. He was not just catching them, he was studying their behaviors, where they lived, and how they interacted with their environment.
But then you have the Japanese economic miracle, the post-war boom. Urbanization swept through areas like Machida with incredible speed. The ponds were paved over. The fields were turned into apartment complexes and shopping centers. The nature that Tajiri loved was effectively destroyed by development. And this wasn't just a change in scenery. It was the destruction of his entire world.
That loss is critical to the psychological origin of the game. Tajiri lost his outdoor hobby due to urbanization. He felt a profound sense of loss for that experience of exploration. So in his junior high years, he transitioned this collecting impulse into the emerging world of video games and arcades. He effectively replaced the insects with pixels. The urge to master a system remained, but the medium shifted from nature to technology.
Yeah, he became completely obsessed with arcades. And this leads us to the birth of Game Freak. Now, most people know Game Freak as the developer studio today, but before it was a studio, Game Freak was a magazine. And I don't mean a glossy publication you buy at a newsstand. This was a doujinshi, a self-published, handwritten fanzine that Tajiri started in 1983 when he was just 17 years old. He was photocopying these things and stapling them together by hand.
There were no dedicated gaming magazines in Japan at the time. Tajiri identified a gap in the market. He was writing strategy guides and deep thoughts on game mechanics when no one else was taking the medium seriously as a subject for analysis. He was treating video games with the same level of scrutiny one might apply to film or literature.
And this little magazine is how he met Ken Sugimori. Sugimori was an aspiring manga artist who saw a copy of the magazine at a local shop. He liked the analysis, but he noticed it was just walls of text. So he reached out to Tajiri and offered to illustrate it. This is the partnership that would eventually define the visual look of the entire franchise. You have the brain in Tajiri and the eye in Sugimori.
They transitioned from critics to creators in the late 1980s. They decided that rather than just writing about the flaws in games, they should develop their own. They formed the development team Game Freak in 1989 and officially incorporated on April 26, 1989. Their first game was an action puzzle title called Quinty, which was published by Namco.
So they are a legitimate studio at this point, but the idea for what would become their magnum opus didn't crystallize until Tajiri saw the Nintendo Game Boy. Nintendo released this handheld console, and it had a specific feature that really caught Tajiri's attention: the Game Link cable.
Most developers view the link cable solely as a means for competitive play, fighting against another player in games like Tetris or Street Fighting games. Tajiri viewed it differently. He saw the cable as a conduit for transfer. He envisioned living organisms moving across that wire from one cartridge to another. He famously imagined an ant crawling across the cable.
There is a really specific anecdote involving Dragon Quest II that highlights this perfectly. Tajiri and Sugimori were both playing the game on their own. Tajiri could never find a specific rare item called the Mysterious Hat. It was a random drop, and the probability was incredibly low. But Sugimori found 2 of them.
That imbalance in asset distribution sparked the realization. If they could connect their games, Sugimori could give his extra item to Tajiri. That concept of trading rare assets became the core mechanic. It solved the frustration of randomness with social interaction.
He combined this trading mechanic with his childhood memories of insect collecting. He also drew heavily on Ultra 7, a popular television show where the protagonist used capsules containing miniaturized monsters to fight on his behalf when he couldn't transform himself.
He also cited Gashapon, the capsule toys from vending machines, as a major influence. The idea was to capture a creature, store it in a capsule, and carry it with you. The thrill of Gashapon is the mystery of what is inside the capsule and the desire to complete the entire set.
Right, so the project went through several names early on. It was Capsule Monsters, or Capramon initially, but they couldn't secure the trademark for that, so it shifted to Pocket Monsters. When they pitched this to Nintendo, it was accepted by the president, Hiroshi Yamauchi, but the budget was incredibly low. They were certainly not given a blank check to make this happen.
This began a period often described as development hell. The game took 6 years to make. That is an eternity in game development, especially for a handheld title in the early 90s. During this time, Game Freak was constantly on the verge of bankruptcy. They had to work on other titles, like Pulseman for the Sega Genesis, just to keep the lights on and pay the staff.
It is frankly remarkable the company didn't fold. There are stories of Tajiri working unpaid, sleeping under his desk, living off convenience store food for months. But during this long gestation, you had key figures refining the product. Junichi Masuda was composing the music and sound effects on extremely limited hardware.
Masuda's work was technical wizardry. The Game Boy sound chip was incredibly primitive. He had to make over 100 creature cries sound distinct using very basic digital synthesis. He manipulated white noise and pulse waves to create recognizable, animalistic sounds.
And you had Atsuko Nishida, who created the character design for Pikachu, but perhaps most importantly, you had the involvement of Tsunekazu Ishihara. He was the producer who managed the budget and served as the liaison between Game Freak and Nintendo. He was the one keeping the project from being canceled entirely.
Ishihara's contribution cannot be overstated here. He used his knowledge of card games and board games to deepen the battle system. He introduced the concept of elemental types like fire, water, and grass, and the rock-paper-scissors balance that defines the combat to this day. He also suggested the encyclopedia device, which gave the player a clear, quantifiable goal: fill the book.
And as they neared completion, the legendary designer Shigeru Miyamoto made a crucial suggestion. He proposed splitting the game into 2 distinct versions, red and green. This wasn't just a marketing gimmick to sell 2 copies to one person. It was a fundamental game design choice. By putting exclusive creatures in each version, they forced the players to use the trading aspect. You physically could not complete the collection without interacting with another human being.
It brilliantly utilized the scarcity principle. If you wanted a specific creature that was not in your version, you had to find a friend who had the other version and convince them to trade. It turned the game into a social currency among children.
So the games were finally released on February 27, 1996. And the reception was honestly very quiet. It wasn't the explosion we associate with the brand today.
It was very quiet. The Game Boy was 7 years old at that point. The industry considered the hardware completely dead. Next-generation consoles like the PlayStation and the Sega Saturn were already dominating the conversation. The media largely ignored the launch. It was seen as a late, niche release for a dying system.
The turning point was a highly specific event: the legendary offer in Korokoro comic. There was a secret creature in the game code called Mew. It wasn't obtainable in normal gameplay at all. It was added at the very last minute by a programmer named Shigeki Morimoto as a secret prank or a post-launch bonus for the staff.
This is a fascinating technical detail. The cartridge was completely full. There was absolutely no space left. Morimoto removed the debug tools at the very end of development and realized there was a tiny void of roughly 300 bytes. He secretly inserted the data from U into that space. He was expressly told not to tamper with the final build, as it could have introduced bugs that would require a massive recall of the game, but he did it anyway.
That is a massive risk. If he had broken the game, Game Freak might have gone under right then and there. But instead, when rumors of this hidden 151st monster started circulating on playgrounds, it created an absolute frenzy. The publisher revealed this secret character and held a lottery in the comic. They offered to physically upload Mew onto the cartridges of 20 winners. They expected maybe a few thousand entries.
They received approximately 78,000 entries. This created massive word-of-mouth buzz. The idea that there was a secret hidden deep in the game's code drove sales exponentially. It turned the game into an urban legend. By September 1996, sales crossed 1 million units.
Following this sudden success, they initiated the media mix strategy. This is where the franchise really starts to sprawl out. You had the manga in CoroCoro comic, which was known for very crude slapstick humor. The early manga had the creatures doing things that would never, ever be approved by the brand managers today. And then, in October 1996, the trading card game launched.
The trading card game was Ishihara's pet project. He wanted a game that was similar to Magic the Gathering, but mathematically accessible to children. It was designed to replicate the role-playing combat mechanics in a tabletop format. It provided a physical anchor for the brand. Even if a child did not own a Game Boy, they could buy a pack of cards and participate in the ecosystem.
Then came in the momentous decision to adapt the property into an animated television series. Nintendo was actually very reluctant about this. They were worried that if the TV show flopped, the negative association would kill the momentum of the games. They were highly protective of their intellectual property.
A production council was formed to manage this risk, involving Game Freak, Creatures, Nintendo, and the production company ShowPro. They had to make crucial creative decisions that would define the brand globally for decades. The most significant of these was the choice of the protagonist's partner creature.
Right, because in the game you choose between a grass type, a fire type, or a water type. If the anime protagonist chose one of those, the show would seem biased toward that specific choice and alienate a third of the audience who chose differently. They needed a neutral option.
They selected Pikachu. The reasoning was that Pikachu's design, yellow, soft, and mouse-like, would appeal to both boys and girls equally, and crucially, to their mothers who controlled the household spending. They needed a mascot that softened the monster aspect of the title. They also decided that the creatures would not speak human language, but would simply say their own names.
Which was a brilliant move for global expansion.
Exactly. It was a strategic decision that made international localization much easier and far cheaper, as they did not have to dub extensive dialogue for hundreds of creatures in dozens of languages.
So the anime premiered on April 1st, 1997, and it was a massive hit. It quickly became the highest-rated show on TV Tokyo, but less than a year later, the franchise faced a true existential crisis. This is the Porygon incident. We need to explain exactly what happened here because it nearly ended the franchise before it ever left Japan.
On December 16, 1997, the episode Computer Warrior Porygon was broadcast. During a scene where the characters are inside a computer network, Pikachu uses an electric attack to stop an incoming virus missile. The animators used a technique called Paka Paka, which involves rapidly flashing two contrasting colors, red and blue, to create a sense of explosive impact and tension.
They flashed these colors at a frequency of 12 hertz. That means 12 full flashes per second. This intense strobing effect triggered photosensitive epileptic seizures in viewers all across Japan. It wasn't just a headache. Children were passing out, having convulsions, and experiencing severe nausea in their living rooms.
Over 600 children were rushed to hospitals by ambulances that evening. It was a national news event. The Ministry of Health, Labor, and Welfare launched an investigation. The police questioned the producers. Nintendo's stock price dropped significantly the next morning. The show was immediately put on an indefinite hiatus, and there was a very real, high-level conversation about canceling the entire franchise permanently.
The incident was incredibly severe. The media called it Pokémon shock. However, remarkably, it did not kill the brand. While the show was off the air, demand for the video games and the merchandise remained incredibly high. Fans were actually writing letters campaigning for the show to return. The anime eventually returned in April 1998 with strict new visual guidelines to prevent any future strobe effects.
And in a strange twist of fate, The international news coverage of the seizure cartoon actually increased global awareness of the brand before it even launched overseas. Everyone in America knew about the dangerous Japanese cartoon before they knew what the game was.
Speaking of that overseas launch, we move into the era of international expansion between 1998 and 2000, and this was not a sure thing at all. Nintendo of America was extremely skeptical about bringing this to the United States.
The prevailing wisdom at the time was that Japanese role-playing games simply did not sell in the West. Furthermore, the aesthetic was considered too kawaii, or cute. The trend for boys' entertainment in the US in the late 90s was cool, dark, and gritty.
Right, you had things like Mortal Kombat and Spawn dominating the playground conversations.
Exactly. Because of this, there was a serious proposal to completely redesign the creatures for the American market. They wanted to make them look aggressive, more like graffiti art or heavily muscled monsters, to appeal to Western sensibilities.
Fortunately, Shigeru Miyamoto and the Nintendo of America president, Minoru Arakawa, rejected these radical changes. They decided to trust the original art. However, they did extensively localize the names and the cultural references. Satoshi became Ash Ketchum. Traditional Japanese rice balls became donuts in the English dub. They wanted the world to feel culturally ambiguous enough that an American child could project themselves right into it.
They partnered with 4Kids Entertainment for the anime licensing. This is where executives Al Kahn and Norman Grossfeld come into the picture. Grossfeld is actually the one who created the English slogan, "Gotta catch 'em all."
And that slogan is so interesting from a regulatory perspective because it sounded like a direct command to purchase products. The FCC generally prohibits that kind of direct commercial imperative in children's advertising.
That is correct. However, the legal team argued that because catching the creatures is the literal core mechanic of the software, the phrase was merely a description of gameplay functionality rather than a command to buy merchandise. It was a brilliant legal loophole that allowed them to blanket the airwaves with the catchphrase.
The franchise officially hit the U.S. in September 1998. And by 1999, it was absolute hysteria. They called it Pokemania. It was featured on the cover of Time magazine. The first theatrical movie was released in November 1999, and critics absolutely hated it. It has a terrible score on review aggregators, but it was a massive box office smash. It opened at #1 and just printed.
The economic impact for the parent companies was staggering. In 1999, this single franchise accounted for roughly 30% of Nintendo's entire global revenue. It effectively carried the company during a period where their home console, the Nintendo 64, was rapidly losing market share to Sony's PlayStation. Without this franchise, Nintendo's financial history in the early 2000s would look very different.
But with that level of cultural saturation came the inevitable backlash. You cannot be that big without people getting angry. By the late 90s and early 2000s, there was a genuine moral panic happening. It really started with the trading cards in elementary schools.
The artificial rarity of the cards created a literal black market environment in school playgrounds. Children do not have the emotional maturity to handle high-stakes financial transactions, which is effectively what trading a highly sought-after holographic card was. There were widespread reports of thefts, muggings, and physical altercations.
Schools across the US, the UK, and Australia completely banned the cards from their grounds due to the constant distraction and the conflicts. And there was also a specific tragedy involving a Burger King promotion. In 1999, Burger King released plastic capsule toys with their kids' meals. A 13-month-old girl tragically suffocated on half of the plastic capsule. It was a horrific event.
Burger King had to issue a recall of over 25 million units. It was the largest toy recall in history at the time. It cast a very serious shadow over the merchandise craze and forced a reevaluation of promotional safety standards.
In addition to the safety concerns, there were class action lawsuits filed claiming the card booster packs were a form of illegal gambling. The legal argument was that because a child spent money without knowing what specific product was inside the pack, it was an unregulated lottery targeted specifically at minors. This is the exact same legal argument we see today regarding digital loot boxes in modern video games.
There was also significant religious criticism. The concept of evolution in the game, even though it functions much more like biological metamorphosis, similar to a caterpillar becoming a butterfly, drew intense ire from creationist groups in the United States. There were accusations of the games promoting occult themes.
The television show South Park even aired a highly critical satire episode in November 1999. It really encapsulated the skeptical adult perspective at the time, painting the phenomenon as a brainwashing commercial enterprise designed solely to turn American children into mindless consumers for the Japanese economy.
By 2001, the initial fever broke. The fad phase ended. Trading card values plummeted across the secondary market. Many cultural commentators assumed the franchise would simply disappear like other 90s trends. The bubble had seemingly burst.
And this is where the business management became crucial. Most fads die exactly at this point. But the stakeholders established the Pokémon Company in Japan in 2000, and later the international branch in 2009. They deliberately restructured to manage the brand as a long-term asset rather than a short-term cash cow. They took control away from the various individual licensors and centralized the global strategy.
The video games continued to evolve steadily during this period. You have the third generation of games, where Junichi Masuda officially took over as director. Then the fourth generation on the Nintendo DS. That generation was highly significant technologically because of the Nintendo DS Wi-Fi capabilities.
Right, that was a huge milestone.
It was. For the first time, Tajiri's original dream of trading creatures without physical cables was fully realized on a global scale. A player in Tokyo could instantly trade with someone in New York.
Then the fifth generation attempted a bit of a soft reboot by introducing over 150 completely new creatures and preventing players from using their old favorites until after the main story was completed. It was a bold, artistic choice that divided some fans but showed they were willing to take risks. And then the sixth generation moved the series into full 3D graphics on the Nintendo 3DS hardware.
Through all of this, the franchise had stabilized. It was a very steady, reliable earner, but it wasn't the mainstream cultural phenomenon it had been in 1999. It was largely viewed as a legacy brand. That perception changed entirely in the summer of 2016.
Pokémon Go. It is hard to overstate how crazy that summer was. And this game actually originated from a Google Maps April Fool's joke back in 2014, where they temporarily put the creatures on the digital map for people to find.
The mobile game was developed by Niantic, led by John Hank. It utilized augmented reality technology to bring the original insect collecting concept into the real physical world. The cultural impact was immediate, and the revenue was unprecedented. It generated $600 million in just 90 days.
And more importantly, it revitalized the brand for a lapsed generation of adults. People who had not played since 1999 were suddenly out in the streets, walking around parks, catching them again. It brought the franchise back to the forefront of global pop culture.
This tremendous momentum led directly into the Nintendo Switch era. The eighth generation of games released in 2019, bringing the mainline role-playing games to a home console for the very first time. And then came the global pandemic in 2020. And this is where things got extremely volatile again regarding the physical trading cards.
The pandemic created a perfect storm for the collectibles market. People were stuck at home with disposable income, a lot of free time, and deep nostalgia. Internet influencers began treating the vintage cards as high-value alternative investment assets. You had massive internet personalities wearing rare, graded cards around their necks to highly publicized boxing matches.
The secondary market prices for vintage cards skyrocketed astronomically. A sealed box of cards that used to cost a few $100s was suddenly selling for hundreds of thousands of dollars at auction houses.
It got so intense that major retailers like Target temporarily suspended all sales of the trading cards in their physical stores. They had to do this because actual physical fights were breaking out in the parking lots. Grown adults were camping out overnight and getting violent over printed cardboard. The management company eventually had to massively overprint the modern sets just to crash the scalper market and stabilize the supply chain.
During this chaotic time, the video games continued to sell remarkably well, despite growing technical criticisms from the core fanbase. The ninth generation games, released in 2022, were the first fully open-world titles in the series. They suffered from significant software bugs, severe frame rate drops, and overall performance issues. Yet the sales figures remained astronomical.
It really proved that the brand loyalty completely overrides technical polish for the general consumer. Which brings us to the present day. We are recording this exploration in the early months of 2026. And looking back at the last few months, the franchise has shown absolutely no signs of slowing down.
The release of the newest Legends title in October 2025 was a major moment. It returned players to a region heavily inspired by France. It continued the successful gameplay style established a few years prior, focusing heavily on a different historical period and real-time catching mechanics rather than just turn-based battles.
And we just saw them.
Also, in January 2026, they unveiled the official logo for the upcoming 30th anniversary. It signals that the corporate entity is preparing for a massive year-long celebration of the brand's history.
On the television side, we have seen a major changing of the guard recently, too. Ash Ketchum, the protagonist who led the anime since 1997, officially retired from the series. The current running series features entirely new protagonists named Liko and Roy.
This was a highly necessary creative risk. To keep the franchise relevant to modern children, they had to move on from a character who had been 10 years old for over 25 years. It allows for new storytelling structures and prevents the narrative formula from becoming completely stale.
We also saw a really interesting live-action drama air on Japanese television recently. It was essentially a meta-commentary on the game's actual impact on people's lives. It followed a woman in the real world rediscovering the games as a working adult and using the lessons to navigate her corporate job.
When we look at the entire legacy of this franchise, the raw numbers are usually the first thing that stands out. Over 480 million software units sold globally. Over 75 billion trading cards produced and distributed. But the soft power aspect is perhaps far more historically interesting.
Yeah, the idea of cool Japan.
Exactly. This specific franchise did more to change the global perception of Japanese culture than perhaps any deliberate government initiative ever could. It normalized Japanese aesthetics, storytelling structures, and consumer culture for the entire world. It actively paved the way for the current massive global popularity of anime and manga.
And to think, it all comes back to that one boy in Wichita. Satoshi Tajiri just wanted to share the pure joy he felt collecting bugs in the forest. He wanted to give kids a way to explore, catalog, and trade. He took a solitary, dying hobby, digitized it, and turned it into the most social game in history.
He undeniably succeeded in his original vision. He created a shared, universal language. A child in Tokyo, a child in Paris, and a child in New York all know what a Pikachu is. They all intrinsically understand the rules of that fictional world. It is a common cultural touchstone that spans multiple generations now.
From a handwritten, photocopied magazine to the highest-grossing media property on Earth, it is quite a journey. And with the 30th anniversary celebrations just kicking off, it does not look like they're stopping anytime soon.
Certainly not. As long as there is that fundamental human desire to collect, trade, and socialize, this franchise will continue to adapt and thrive.
I wonder what the landscape of global entertainment will look like when the 60th anniversary rolls around, and whether the core mechanics will still hold up in whatever virtual spaces we inhabit then. Thanks for listening.